Hope everyone is safe today, and I understand this is a very, very difficult time for a lot of people. So hopefully everybody is doing okay. So today we're going to talk about influencing others and the role that ethics and manipulation and deception and persuasion play in that. So first of all, what is the goal? What are we talking about here? We're talking about influencing those around us to produce the goals or a goal of the organization without the force or authority or sanction and in an ethical manner. Or otherwise put, influence ethically to produce a goal without the use of force, authority, or sanction. Now, clearly, leaders can certainly order people to do things, and they do, and sometimes that is necessary. But generally, the better idea is trying to get people to do things voluntarily because they think it's a good idea and they want to follow you because you're a good ethical leader. Okay, so that's generally what we're talking about today. And to be successful at this, you need a few things. You've got to have an ethical core. You've got to have integrity. And just as important, you have to have a reputation for being ethical and someone with integrity. We'll talk a little bit about what that all means. You need to be able to recognize manipulation and deception because it is out there. As leaders, people will try to manipulate you, will try to deceive you, and it is successful. So you need to pay attention to that. And the ability to persuade. Not everybody has those skills. Some do, some don't, and some have to develop them. Sometimes we call this being politically savvy. Okay, not in the capital P political sense, but just being able to influence those, and again, influence those ethically and without forcing people to do it, ordering them to do it. So I'm going to try to get a little interaction here. You've got to have integrity to successfully influence others. I'm glad I can't see everybody because I'm going to make a reference and maybe not everybody will get it, but as Billy Joel said, it's a matter of trust. And I'm just assuming everyone's microphone is muted so I can't hear the uproarious laughter. In any event, what is integrity? What I'd like, Lamont, if you can instruct people how to annotate in here. Really what I'd like you to do is just write a word that you think means integrity, what it means to you, any word that comes to mind. So I'd like to get the audience to participate here a little bit. Yep. Okay, so we're getting a lot of great comments here. And I'm also seeing that no offense to anyone, don't have the worst handwriting. Empathy, honesty, dependable, open, trustworthy, doing what you say, doing the same thing in public as you do in private, that absolutely, being truthful to yourself and others, good reputation, excellent, yeah, fantastic. One on the bottom here that I can't quite read. Values, humility. I think absolutely humility falls in that category. Morals. Thank you very much. I think these all are great and great indicators of someone's integrity. So if we can, Lamont, if we can clear these. So when we talk about, we use a lot of these words, integrity, ethics, morals, values, a lot of times interchangeably. But when we talk about integrity, we're really talking about consistency, and consistency of someone abiding by their own ethical code, or those of a particular organization or profession, whether it's scientific ethics, medical ethics, lawyer ethics. No laughing on that one. And doing so consistently, and that's important, and that's typically how we kind of look at integrity. That someone is consistently acting in accordance with either their own ethical or moral code or those of their organization. And this matters because if people do not view you as an ethical person or one with integrity, they're not likely to trust you. And when they're not likely to trust you, they're not likely to kind of go along with you when you want to influence them, and again, for good. And when we talk about ethics, ethics are compared to morals. Morals are more the personal ethical code. Values are things that are important to us. So, but with ethics, we're not typically talking about right versus wrong. And hopefully we all know what is right and what is wrong. But typically what we're talking about is a clash of core values where you really could have two right answers. And you see this in really four broad structures. Truth versus loyalty. Maybe you know something about what's going on in the organization, but you can't share it, but you have a friend or a colleague or a peer that may be significantly impacted by this information, and whether you should share that or not. The individual versus the community, same kind of thing. Short-term versus long-term, we see that with respect to budgeting issues. Justice versus mercy. Someone who maybe has been working in an organization for a long period of time, put in a lot of effort, but maybe is no longer useful. And what do you do with that person? So just to provide that kind of framework. So what are we talking about with an ethical person, and what does that look like? So leaders and others are associated with, and their ethics are associated with certain traits, behaviors, and decisions. But first, you've got to have, a substantive ethical core about you, okay? And these are just, all the other words that you came up with, these are just examples. There's many others, but there's being honest, caring, trustworthy, sincere, being accurate and factual when you're talking. But, and this maybe is similar to sincere, but being authentic. And we hear that a lot these days. And, some people can, fake things for a while, and usually they can make a good first impression. But after a while, you'll realize that maybe they're not as authentic as their caring seems to indicate, or their statements about certain things or facts. So you've got to have these traits. You've got to have this substantive ethical core. And you've got to behave ethically. You've got to be open and transparent. You have to be communicative, and you have to be clear in your communications. So that is extremely important. Show concern for staff, for your peers, your coworkers, provide a safe working environment, and of course, act in accordance with your ethical principles and ethical decisions. How people know we are behaving ethically a lot of times comes in the decisions that we make. And we know that the decisions don't always please everybody, okay? But hopefully your decisions kind of encompass these three things: that they're objective, that they're fair, that you, to the extent you can, you take in the broad perspective of different stakeholders. Now, we don't always have all that time to do that. And also that you have a kind of clear, repeatable process for making decisions. It doesn't mean that you're going to make the same decision. It doesn't always mean that people are going to be able to predict the decision you're going to be making, but that you have a certain way of going about it. Now, we all can change and adjust our process and how we approach things over time. as we learn the way others do it and we adapt our methods. But having this repeatable process and having it clear and transparent to others will help you be able to influence people for good. So you've got these ethical traits and behaviors and decisions, and that's great, okay? But you also need to have a reputation for being ethical, for having integrity. Because if you don't, then people are not going to follow you. People are not going to want to just take a risk in working on a project. They're not going to want to risk their own capital in an organization if they don't trust you. If you don't have a reputation for being ethical, for following through, for following rules, for delivering what you promise. And this is a huge one, giving credit and taking blame. And we'll talk about this also in another second, in another context. But we all know the people that are out there that will just take the credit. And when you have that, and particularly spreading blame, and when you have that, then you have problems because people are not going to want to go out on a limb for you. They're not going to want to follow you. It may even be so bad that people actually, as we'll talk about in deception and manipulation shortly, they may actually want to sabotage what you're trying to do, depending on how you've treated them. So you need to develop the reputation for being ethical. Now, why do you need to do this? Because not everybody knows that you're being ethical every day, that you're making ethical decisions. It's not like you go, send out an email to everybody, hey, I was offered some tickets to the Nats game by this contractor that wanted to do business with the agency, with the organization. You know what? But I said no. I did the ethical thing. We don't always do that, and people don't see all the ethical things we do every day. So you need to demonstrate that ethics are an important part of your agenda. And how can you do that? Okay. Well, we can look at 3 ways of doing it. Number 1, you should be role modeling ethical behavior, ethical decision making. You should let people know that it matters and that it's important to you. And one of the better ways of doing this is communicating and sharing how important it is. I was speaking with some agency leaders from a particular agency yesterday, and we were talking about this issue and talking about examples of how to go about communicating and sharing the importance of ethics. And what they do is when they have their staff meetings every 2 to 3 weeks, or whatever it is, they have something called, if I'm remembering this correctly, something called an ethics minute, where it is this responsibility is assigned to a different staff member every week to come up with some ethical issue to essentially teach the other staff, teach their peers and their leaders about. And that's one way, just one way of demonstrating that ethics are important to you. Another is being careful, and I believe this was on the prior slide, being careful about making jokes about ethics issues. When you're in a leadership position, whether you like it or not, people are watching you, and they're watching nearly everything you do, and sometimes you just can't imagine why, but they are. Okay? They're watching what you say, how you say it, how you interact with people, how you respond to issues of concern. If you blow them off, you say, oh, that's not a big deal, that tells them a lot about you and a lot about how you will actually look at ethical issues or not interesting, but ethical issues or difficult issues in the future. So be careful about jokes and sarcasm when it comes to issues of importance and issues of ethics, okay? The last one here, reward versus discipline. This can be a little bit tricky On the reward side, I don't necessarily mean, you know, a performance award or a bonus or anything like that. What I mean is really recognizing people who are willing to step up and raise difficult issues of consequence that might matter in a particular project. And how you react to that will tell everyone else how they can behave. If you react very negatively and you put them down or joke about it, the likelihood of someone else, when they see an issue, raising that with you just diminishes. And as a leader, you need to understand that. So again, all of this is building your reputation as that ethical person, that ethical leader, so that people will trust you and trust you to do the right thing. You know, one other point, you know, these ethical rules, these government ethics or other ethics rules, these are a floor of behavior. You know, hopefully we're doing more than that. Okay. And discipline. This is another area. You need to call it out when you see it, when there's someone acting unethically or misbehaving or saying something in a meeting that you think is offensive or unethical or not civil. So these are things that, you know, ways that you can create this culture and develop a reputation for being that ethical person, that ethical manager, that ethical leader. Because again, these are things that will help you to influence people down the road. Again, if you're not trustworthy, you don't have integrity, what you're going to have left is power, and you're not going to have power forever. Okay, so now what? Well, unfortunately, as we've all seen and all experienced, there are those out there who will seek to manipulate and deceive you as a leader and others that may be involved in a project. And there are many reasons that they would do that. But if you're going to be influencing people and trying to accomplish something organization-wide or across a couple of offices, then you're going to need to be able to identify individuals who are manipulative and who might seek to deceive. So using the same annotation function that you did before, can someone tell us who this is? And no, it's not Derek Jeter. Okay. All right. So we've got Tom Pritt. Yeah, it might look a little, maybe in his new Tampa Bay Buccaneers uniform. Okay, so we can clear these because we do have the right answer up there. So yes, we are talking about Machiavelli. And a lot of people associate Machiavelli with this last phrase in the last bullet there, that the ends justify the means, that it doesn't really matter how I get there as long as I get to my goal. So when I'm talking about manipulators, deceivers, you know, I'm using Machiavelli or Machiavellians in that kind of context. So how do we go about detecting manipulators, people who will be deceitful, people who try to use unethical ways to get things done? How can you tell someone falls in that category, somebody is a manipulator? And again, with the annotations, I'd like to see what suggestions people have for, you know, what kinds of things you can see in individuals and how they behave that indicates to you that they're not necessarily operating on the most ethical plane. So go ahead, use the same function.
Hi, Jim. I have 2 answers via chat so far. We have one person commenting willful withholding of relevant information. We have difference in how they treat people, and their stories don't line up.
False people, insecure, they don't listen to others, snakes. They say what others want to hear. Change the voice and tone. Talk about people behind their backs. They spin facts. They're two-faced. Something different version of the situation. Different people. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Don't listen to others. Daily work behavior. Lies. Absolutely. Behaves one way with upper management, another way. Yes, we're going to talk about that in a second. Willfully ignorant. Yeah. Great. These are all great. Thank you, everybody. Self-centered. Make others do the work and then take credit. Yes, yes, credit is a big one. Very big one. Okay. All right, great. Thank you, everybody. So we can clear this. And I, again, have a non-exhaustive list here. They sometimes will seek power, not necessarily to help others, but just for power's sake. And they seek promotion as the goal, rather than it just happens to be the result of good, hard, ethical work. Taking credit, manipulating, they create losers rather than winners, okay? They self-promote. Now, granted, there are all times when we have to do this, but in a more grandiose way here. This last one, somebody wrote there, they talk differently to the bosses than they do to their peers or subordinates. You know, one thing about manipulators or Machiavellians is that many times these individuals are liked by the boss or the superior than they are by peers or subordinates. And you know, this is something where an example is typically they are high achievers, that they accomplish the goals of their office, okay? So that what the boss and the leaders see is that accomplishment, something in the annual report that says, oh yes, we met these targets, okay? So that is certainly pleasing to leadership. But the peers, the subordinates that work more closely with them actually would have a better idea of what they're like, okay? And similarly, the whispers to higher ups, they'll say, oh, did you hear this about this person? Oh, I'm not really sure about that person. All right, so these are some things that you can look for. Again, this is just kind of a comparison, the manipulator versus those that are more, perhaps a little more savvy about things. One item here about agendas is the hidden agenda versus being open and transparent. They will often make it very difficult for you to figure out what they're trying to do or why, what their motivations are, and are not transparent about their goals or their interests. And we'll talk about that in terms of persuasion in a little bit. And when people are not willing to share what their interests are, then it really does feel more like a negotiation rather than kind of an influence attempt, an attempt to get something done for the good of the organization. You know, the accepting blame and deflects blame, of course. So you need to be able to identify these people, because if you're going to try to influence, and you're going to try to get people, say, across an organization or across offices to work together, then you're going to need to understand who might get in the way, okay, and how to address that. And, you know, you have to keep in mind that the manipulators are they're all around, okay? And they will manipulate in different ways. And again, you know, this word manipulation, I understand it can have different connotations. In some ways, we all manipulate certain things, but I'm using this in a more negative connotation, obviously. But they're all around. We've got bosses, peers, subordinates that fit into these categories at various times. And there's all kinds of ways to handle manipulators. Sometimes confronting them head on is just not the best way. I would try to avoid trying to prove that someone is a manipulator. It's helpful to just know that and try to understand what their energy is all about. But usually it's about their organization, or they're part of the organization, rather. So let's talk a bit about deception. Leaders are deceived all the time, okay? And there are lots of reasons for that. Number one, it works, okay? But why are some leaders more susceptible to deception than others? Well, one reason is trust. People are more trusting than others right off the bat. There are some people that will immediately trust individuals they've just met and will trust them until it's proven otherwise. And I tend to fall in that category. But there are others where the trust has to be earned over time, and people in the middle. So like me, it's very difficult when I trust people initially and then to be disappointed. So why are leaders targets of deception, and how could they be deceived? They have all the power. They have control. Well, one reason is fear. And what are they afraid of? What could they be afraid of? So I'd like, if we can do the annotation again, what would leaders be afraid of that might lead them to being deceived? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Losing power. Yes. Not being like that is huge. Huge. Being exposed. Failure. Loss of power, competition, shame, ego. Yes, absolutely. Excuse me. These are all excellent points. Okay, thank you very much. So we can, not being the smartest, the smartest person in the room, that is absolutely one. And it also, that gets the issue of taking credit and giving out blame. All right, so if we can, thank you. We can clear that. Thank you. So yeah, there's lots of fear, right? And depending on where they are in the organization, they may have different points of pressure and different fears. If you're a high-level political appointee, you may have different fears than if you're a career employee or been in an organization a long time. So being wrong, being seen as indecisive, their legacy can be a big one. People are only at an organization for a period of time and they know it. They're concerned about, well, okay, what am I going to be known for? And that can impact how they make decisions. Losing money, being criticized, greed, not wanting to take on certain people, certain players in an organization. And a lot of it comes from self-deception. They are very susceptible to false flattery. Great idea. Hey, boss, that was fantastic. Wonderful. I really liked the way you handled that. That was beautiful. Okay. Too many yes people. They're really out of touch with reality. And when we talk, people mention power and losing power. One thing about that is once we have it, we don't like to lose it. And once we have it, we like to actually use that power. Okay. You want to, I think Abraham Lincoln said something about testing someone's character. Give them power and that will test them. Okay. So they get out of touch. They have pressures, they have temptations. There's a great History Channel documentary recently, also the book by Ron Chernow about Ulysses S. Grant. And throughout his life, he was deceived by many people, both in the military and the Civil War, and when he became president. He was deceived by many people that were very close to him, and he just could not believe that these people would deceive him. And to the point where he just couldn't believe it. He would defend them. And then later, when shown indisputable evidence of their wrongdoings, he would realize that, and then he would be crushed. So these are just some things to keep in mind about why leaders are the target of deception and that it works. So you have to be mindful of that. And the way that, I'll come back to this. So the way that this deception typically comes, it's in how you get information, or the information you're told or not told, right? Maybe you're given kind of half the story. So you have to consider the motives of why someone is giving you information. Have you even asked for it, but they're coming to you with it? What's their track record for being accurate, for giving you the full story? Are they known? What is their reputation, right? Are they known for providing an accurate, fair, objective accounting for things? What's their style like? Okay, are they just agreeing or listening to you intensely? I do want to go back here. So one thing you can deal with in terms of deception is also similar to dealing with unethical behavior meetings, is call it out, just question it. You don't have to necessarily point fingers and say, you're lying, you're trying to deceive me, but question facts, question statements critically, all right? And when you do that, you show people that you care, that people are just not going to be able to get something by you, that you're actually paying attention to it. Okay, so that's one way of trying to handle deception. Let's see. So, in terms of the yes people, obviously, if you're going to reveal your opinion first about something, you're more likely to get people to say yes, or that's a good idea as a leader than if you just ask for opinions first. It's something you obviously should know, but keep that in mind. One way of dealing with deception in meetings is, you can actually give people a role for being a devil's advocate, for providing bad news or talking about how a project may not work. That's just another way of dealing with it. So let's go back for a second. So we are, having to deal with deception a fair amount. Some people do it clearly knowing they're deceiving. Others think they're doing the right thing because maybe you only want certain information from this particular office or this particular group. But just be cognizant of the fact that people will want to deceive you. It is absolutely amazing. I saw it when I've seen it a lot just generally, but also in my career in the government over 8.5 years. And it was just amazing to me to see that how sometimes blatant it was from various individuals. And so just, you have to be aware of that. Okay, you're ethical, you have this reputation that you are a person of integrity, you know who the schemers, liars, deceivers are. Okay, now what? Persuasion. We have to, before we start to try to persuade, we have to understand whether people are willing to be persuaded. And it's the old joke of, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, one, but the light bulb has to want to change. I'm pausing for laughter. Anyway, I assume there's uproarious laughter everywhere over the interweb. But this is something to keep in mind, okay? So one thing that a lot of us think about and wonder about is, we have this instinct that data and facts and numbers that support what we're trying to get across will work, will convince people. And now, for some people, it does. But others, it doesn't. And it's important to keep that in mind. And why doesn't that always work? Well, once people have committed to a decision, and you see this in your daily lives, it can be difficult to persuade them to adopt a different one. And in particular, it's particularly difficult when people have firmly held beliefs about things, rather than, I've already made a decision about this thing. I don't want to go back and appear to be weak. But when the people have firmly held beliefs, it's difficult to get them to change a belief. And what we might think in terms of data, facts, figures, logical arguments would work to help them change, it doesn't always work that way. And when we do have firmly held beliefs and people are trying to convince us through what seem like great arguments and facts and figures, we may then start to ignore them or discount what they're saying to us or discount the source, right? And it makes us uncomfortable, and we'll start to rationalize around that. So, of course, when we get information, we're going to evaluate that relative to certain beliefs. And one way to address this, and we'll talk about common ground a little bit, is trying to get to a common ground. So persuasion is not really about negotiating. We're not really talking about going to the car dealer or wherever and, exchanging offers. It's really it's a process that involves several stages. Now, there are times when we have to move quickly on things, and sometimes quickly means 2 years versus 1 day or 1 hour, okay? So we're talking about a process here. We're not talking about begging, forcing, threatening. Again, we're talking about influence, and one part of this is persuasion. So persuasion typically has a number of phases. One is you're gathering information, you're discovering all kinds of information about the particular issue. You're preparing, and then you're having a dialogue. And this is where I'm talking about the amount of time this is. This dialogue might take a while. It might take many conversations. And we'll talk about this at the end about pitfalls, 4 common pitfalls of persuasion. So one thing you want to start off with is, are you open-minded about this? Are you willing to change your mind? Are you willing to hear, you have an idea, you want to have 2 groups, 2 offices come together and do something different. Are you open-minded to something different than your idea? Okay, and that will help you to influence others. There's a Harvard Business Review article about the 4 steps to successful persuasion. Credibility, common ground, or common motivations, the evidence you're going to provide, and kind of that emotional connection you're going to have with people. I would venture to say that without credibility, the rest doesn't matter, unless you're just talking about forcing people or threatening people or ordering people to do things. Because without credibility, without trustworthiness, without all these other things, you're lost. So there's 2 aspects, I think, of credibility. One is, your subject matter credibility and your expertise. So that comes from, you have a particular track record in a certain area, in a certain subject matter. You're an expert in this particular subject. And relationships. that you have some robust and deep relationships in this particular industry or across the industry and across fields, and you've developed this over time. And one thing I think that's important is that you are given the benefit of the doubt, even if you don't have the subject matter expertise. Now, some people have both. Some people only have one of them, and we'll have to address how to deal with that deficit. You know, one example that I give is when I joined the Merit Systems Protection Board in 2010, deals with, for those of you not federal folks, deals with federal employees and federal appeals, and that's something I'd done for 17 years before I started there. So I came in, I was hoping at least, came in with some subject matter expertise, but I did not have the relationships in the organization, so I had a deficit that I had to deal with. So let's say you have this, you don't have the subject matter expertise, but you have the relationships. Here are some ways you can address that. You can educate yourself in these areas. You can have maybe staff prepare you, like here's what you need to know about these particular issues. Demonstrate that you're trying to learn and you're learning about the different subject matters that you're dealing with. So that's one way in terms of your subject matter credibility. And then relationships. This can be difficult. You will need, this is difficult in one way because this takes more time and can take more time. But if you have this deficit, it is something to pay attention to very early on in whatever organization you're in, because that will set the stage. Go back here. That will set the stage for developing further relationships. Okay, if you start off on a bad note, that's going to affect your reputation going forward, especially in those early meetings with people. Because from those early meetings, that person you met with is going to then go and talk to them, and they're going to say, oh, what's he like? What's she like? Okay, so it's going to start really early on, so you have to pay attention to that. So you've got credibility, you've got your subject matter credibility, and you've got your relationship credibility. And again, without that, I think you've got nothing, unless you have power, and then that's it. So some of the other points that I want to mention here is, you want to look for a common ground, a common motivation. You want to identify what the interests are. So you may not want to start with, okay, I want to combine these offices. Well, that person in that other office is probably going to say no. Start with why. What is the reason why you want to do this? Presumably, it's not just to consolidate power and you can be like the king or queen maker of that new Uber office, right? But presumably it's for some good reason. And talking about that and sharing that with that other office director can be really important in identifying those shared benefits from doing something like that. You need to have an understanding of who you're dealing with. Now, many times, especially in the government, and people come in and want to do some things different, and you hear this, oh, this is the way that we've always done it. Well, sometimes there's a good reason for doing things this way for this 20 years or whatever it is. But you may want to ask why someone feels this way, why they have this opinion, and just talk to them about it and get an understanding. So it's listening, right? It's listening to what they're saying and understanding what they're saying and understanding their perspective and how they fit in the organization. And then we talked a little bit about this. Obviously, if your facts and figures don't add up, it's not going to fly, okay? But keep in mind how to present your evidence, how to present the data, whatever it is. And finally, this emotional connection, understanding your audience, and whether they're even in a frame of mind to hear you. Okay. So finally, there's some common pitfalls to trying to persuade people. I would say that the the last one, assume persuasion is a one-shot effort, is one of the bigger mistakes. Again, sometimes you don't have the time to do this, but my experience is that, you know, persuasion and particularly influencing people for good, for the good of the organization, to get, you know, a project going or completed that will help, and to do so ethically, takes time, and is not one conversation. It's a number of conversations, and not always with the same people. Okay, and having a broader understanding of the organization and what you're trying to do. So, you know, all these things, you know, come into play in terms of influencing. You know, your ability to persuade, your ability to tell a story, your subject matter credibility, the relationships that you have within your group and across the organization, but most importantly, your integrity. And if you don't have integrity, and you are not someone who has a reputation for following through, and you are someone that has a reputation for taking credit and giving blame, a lot of people are just not going to follow you. So understanding that, understanding how people are going to try to derail things you're going to do, all kind of fit into this issue of influencing others and having political savvy to get things done in an ethical way. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions, comments.
Yes, hi Jim. So we actually only have one question so far, and this was previously before, where they asked, what if your boss is the deceiver, or the boss is the deceiver?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing to deal with, and there's not a lot of ways to address that. Now, I'm always a fan of trying to deal with things directly and trying to understand why someone is acting a certain way without making accusations. So instead of saying, "Why are you trying to deceive me? Why are you, you know, manipulating?" Trying to dig underneath as to why people are doing things. So what is it about this idea that you know, is attractive to you? Why do you want to do this? I think getting to the why can sometimes draw out the deceivers and manipulators. And if they don't want to tell you, then you know you have a problem, and there's only so much you can do. Now, maybe you have an ally. Maybe there is someone that has the ear of that person. But if they're not willing to be open, again, it's like that light bulb. If they're not willing to see it and understand this about themselves and be self-aware, they're not likely to change. And then you're left with some difficult choices as to what to do. And sometimes those choices mean not staying where you are, unfortunately.
Thanks, Jim. We have another question. How do you deal with someone for whom facts don't matter?
And another very difficult thing, I think you have to focus on what their motivations are, okay? And try, or what their interests are. Because when you learn about people's interests rather than their position, you know, if you're willing to give me $50,000 and no more, I'd like to understand why. So what's the interest there? What's your motivation? What's your goal for the agency or this organization or this group? And then you can approach things not so much from a facts and figures point of view, but from how, you know, what they're saying may impact the agency. You know, what are their pressure points? What are their interests? What are they worried about? You have to kind of have those understandings too when you're trying to influence people, and particularly those individuals for whom facts and figures maybe don't necessarily matter. But sometimes it's not so much the facts and figures. Sometimes it's just at that moment, they don't want to be dealing with, say, another office where there would be drama if you tried to do what was being suggested. But if it's a chronic thing, that can be difficult. But I would just focus not so much on the table with, oh, look at these facts. Why are you saying that? Why do you not agree with me? Try to focus on something else. What are their motivations? What interests them about this particular issue?
Is there a way to protect your organization / boss from being manipulated when you see it occurring, but others are blind to it?
Well, if you see it occurring, number one, if you have a leader or boss who is open to hearing about it and is secure in who they are as a person and a leader, then you should talk to them about it and talk to them about how to address it. If you don't have that leader, then you again have some difficulties to deal with. One way of dealing with the manipulators and the deceivers is when other people know it's happening, like in that question, if you don't do anything about it, it will just keep happening. And that's something that you can raise with that leader. It will just keep happening, and then the person won't know who to trust. Because other people will see it. They'll see, like kids, they'll see what they can get away with, right? And that's what they'll do.
Another question from George, our very own George Reese. He worked with a fellow who described the slippery slope of bad ethical behavior, and wanted to know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about what that is.
Slippery slope of bad ethical behavior, meaning in an organization or by one particular person. If it's the organization, then it's a matter of the culture of the organization where, and you'll see this if you go from one organization to another, where one organization is clearly not risk averse to doing things that are sketchy, and others that are very careful. And careful because the rules, the ethics rules mean something. When it's an individual, then, I think first of all, training, people that are new to the workplace, particularly if we're talking about the government, training is vital, and repeated training is vital, so that things just kind of become ingrained in them, that we just don't do certain things. Okay. But if they can't get the message or keep doing things that are unethical, then steps need to be taken to correct that. And if they don't improve, then they shouldn't be there.
We have another question. She says, what do you do if you're considered too nice or too much of a rule follower or too ethical, and people sideline you because of that?
Yeah, that unfortunately, that is too much of the case, and that's a leadership problem. And what you don't have there is you don't have a leader who's willing to step up and recognize that person for what the good is there, to be a rule follower, to be ethical. And that's where you need leadership to step in, because it really does matter. Like I said, people are watching them all the time, and then if someone speaks up and then they're sidelined and leadership doesn't do anything about it, it's not likely to change. And sometimes whistleblowers certainly fall into this category, but leadership really needs to take, it's going to make sense, the lead.
This question is from an attendee that says, I find that these days time is incredibly compressed, and finding time to explore issues of ethics and integrity is difficult when you're fighting major fires all the time. Understanding that persuasion is not a one-shot deal, how do you create a space for ethical issues that can be raised whether you are the employee or the boss? Beyond just make time, what suggestions do you have?
Well, I think the example I gave of this other organization where they do create a space in their meetings every meeting for ethics issues. On your in your spare time, there's just loads of resources about ethics and ethical issues. One thing that I do every week, every Sunday, the New York Times Magazine has a column called The Ethicist, and that deals with all kinds of, sometimes it doesn't even seem like ethical questions, but ethical issues. And some deal with work, some deal with, lately the genetic DNA websites, the 23andMe, and people learning that they have relatives and whether it's ethical for them to contact them. So it's just one example of what you can do kind of on your own time. But there are just loads of resources, and sometimes that's the problem. There's too many options. But I think raising the issues and talking about them, and they don't have to be super dire and serious, like this person did the worst thing and they got fired, but there's some interesting dilemmas, especially when it's the issue, the clash of core values that we talked about. It's not so much right versus wrong, but there's two right answers, and how do we go about balancing, coming up with a decision there?
Thank you so much. Another question. Lots of amazing questions so far. This one is, we have a very fresh division. For example, boss favorites play against other team members. They have reached out with concern because in some instances it's borderline and perhaps bullying. Is there any way to talk with the boss about how to mitigate this fracturing of other staff?
Well, sometimes they may not actually know they're doing it. We all have blind spots. I know maybe some of these people on the call, I don't know. But when you develop relationships with people at work, and some people you have more things in common with than others, and you may hang around with them more. And because of that, sometimes you do develop these blind spots, like, oh, I'm gonna trust this person because he and I love talking about the Nationals all the time. That doesn't always mean that they're going to be upfront with me or share accurate information. So that's something they may not even realize that they're doing, or the perception that there's a perception. So if this person is secure enough to hear this feedback, then it's something that I think I would raise with them. In the absence of doing that, you may, if you have someone that also has the ear of this leader that you trust and you think can carry that message, you may want to do that. But another way to kind of approach it too is what are the motivations of the boss? If the boss's motivation have a lot to do with just numbers and meeting numbers every quarter, and you can see that this is impacting it, then maybe that is something that you can raise with them. Sometimes I think leaders don't so much want to hear about how it makes you feel, but how it's impacting other people. And they should, but sometimes it's just, that's the way things are.
And we have a longtime viewer who asks, what is the role of followership in all of this?
Well, I think when you're talking about influence, you're talking about followership. You're talking about getting people to be on board with things, initiatives, projects, changes that you think are good for the organization. And I think it's all about followership and getting people to, this word engagement, getting people to give that discretionary energy that they don't have to give in doing their jobs. So I think followership and getting people to want to follow you is important. I mean, again, if you're in a position of power and authority, you can order people to do things. That's for sure. But that's not the best way to get things done. It's just not.
We have lots of words of gratitude for you, Jim, and they're asking if you could recommend 3 books to read to continue discovering this topic.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to certainly give credit. These are not all my ideas, that is for sure. One book that I'll give you one book that deals with persuasion and kind of the way the mind works in terms of being convinced of things is it's a book called The Influential Mind by Terry Giroux. That's one. The other is blind spots, which talks about why people who are seemingly good make unethical choices, wrong choices. And that has a lot to do with kind of if we talk about a hypothetical ethical situation here, everyone is going to say they're going to do the most ethical thing. But the problem is when it gets time to make a decision, we have other factors and pressures that get to us. And then we sometimes don't even see the ethical dimension in the issue. Or later we rationalize it. Oh, I did act ethically. There was no ethical issue. So blind spots is one. Another one. And then there are two books on specifically on political savvy that I have to tell you I'm totally blanking on. I'm happy to share in an email or some other communication.
I have one last question. The question is from Sheila. They ask what if you get a lot of resistance when trying to influence? Is it okay to just follow up to think about it?
If I get resistance to influence, well, I think that what I do with that just depends on what that resistance is and why there's resistance. Maybe it's because Congress has cut the budget by 2%, which makes a big difference for that office. And maybe it's not something that can be done at all. Maybe it's resistance to the idea philosophically that things have just never been done that way. And then that becomes more of persistence as well, and continuing the conversation and learning information about what's motivating them. So it depends, I think, it depends on why there's resistance in terms of what you do.
And yeah, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send an email to Jim. Jim's contact information will be in the slides provided. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.